Hi, my name is Erica Young and I'm a pronouns she, her. I am a third-year printmaking student and freelance artist. And I'm going to be showing you how to make a Linocut print at home from my beautiful basement. So I'm primarily a printmaker and I work mostly in etchings and woodcuts. And since quarantine has started, I've lost access to the studios in which I usually do these, and I've had to figure out some solutions to continuing my practice at home. Linocut has been a great way to do this just because it's one of the easiest ways to print without access to a studio. Over the course of quarantine, I have come up with or researched solutions to a lot of problems that you're going to face printing at home, like outside of a studio, and I'm going to teach you about these. So to start, I'm going to show you a couple of Linocuts that I've done recently, just to give you an idea of what the medium looks like. If you haven't been to an arts high school or had the opportunity to be exposed to these, you might not know. So this is a zine. I'll hold it as close to the camera as I can. It is called Things. It's about things that I've seen on the ground. And so when you're working at home, I do find it better to work on a smaller scale like this, just because it's quite a lot easier to get an even tone when you're doing this. To give an example of what can go wrong when you're working on a larger scale, this is another relief print that I did, and as you can see, the ink is not quite as even. Nothing disastrous, but it's definitely easier to work on a smaller scale. So zines are an example of something that you can do with Linocut prints. It's quite time consuming to do this, but it's a lot of fun. Linocut prints are also good for making a stamp or for just transferring an image in a standard print. So these are obviously in my own style, and yours can look however you want, but one thing to keep in mind is that you're not going to get any shades of gray working in a Linocut print, so you're going to want to think of alternative ways to shade your work, be that pointillism, lines, cross-hatching, really whatever works for you and your style. So before anything else, I'm going to go over some of the materials that you're going to need to print. And all of these can be found pretty easily at a standard art supply store or even a dollar store. Price has been something that's been a barrier to me personally for creating art. And I find that Linocut printing is great for this just because everything can be done so cheaply and fairly accessibly. So obviously you're going to need your linoleum, and this can be found at pretty much any standard art supply store or online if you're somewhere remote or don't feel comfortable going into stores. I've cut these down to size, so it is very easy to change the size of your linoleum, even to cut it into more interesting shapes if you feel so inclined. So I would say that size isn't that much of something to consider when you're buying it. It does come in a couple of different kinds. There's hard linoleum and soft linoleum. So you can see this guy bends fairly easily. I'm not going to do that with this because it's probably going to snap in half. They both have their pros and their cons. The soft linoleum is way easier to carve, but sometimes the line isn't as crisp, although I find this to be less of an issue working at home just because usually it's the pressure of the printing press that really exacerbates this. I would recommend getting more linoleum than you think you're going to need, just so you have the opportunity to practice your mark making a bit and not worry about getting it absolutely perfect the first time. So you're also going to need a carving tool along with this. And some people will say that you need specialized tools right off the bat, But I personally find that these speedball carvers are completely fine for working at home. Another upside to these guys is that you want to keep your carving tip sharp when you're working, just for safety and ease, and it just looks better as well. If you don't have a whetstone and just the proper sharpening tools at home, this can be difficult to figure out. Also, if you don't have somebody to show you in person, you might mess up your nice tools. So with these guys, you can buy the tips like super cheaply and replace it if it gets dull. Then worry about sharpening it when studios reopen. These Lee Valley chisels are quite a bit nicer. Also fairly cheap. They are probably good to have if you plan on getting into woodcuts, but they're not completely necessary. So you're also going to need a rubber or plastic brayer, which is just a word for a kind of roller. And this is what you're going to use to roll out your bed of ink and also to apply it to your print. The ones we have at school are very expensive and quite high quality, and you do kind of notice the difference, but for working at home, it's not super important. For working at school, you want to have one that can cover your whole print in one roll, so there's no repeat and you don't end up with a line or areas of the print that aren't inked evenly. This is much less of a concern at home because it's probably not going to look perfect anyway. If you're really in a pinch, you could probably just wrap a rolling pin with plastic wrap or jig something like that up. Probably won't work great, but it probably will get the job done. So the ink you're going to use is very important. You want to make sure that you have water-based block printing ink that will look like this. If you end up with the wrong kind of ink or something oil-based, the process is probably not going to work. And if it's oil-based, it's also going to be really annoying to clean up without the very useful chemicals that we have at school. So again, this can be found at any standard art supply store or ordered online. I think this particular ink is about $14 or $15. If you don't feel like buying a ton of it at once, or you're not sure that Linocut printing is something that you're going to continue with, like you're just experimenting, you can get one of these little guys too, and I think it's only $5 or $6. You also experiment with like a bunch of different colors if you end up with one of those. And paper is actually a little less important, especially if you're just starting out. I personally like kozuke, which is a Japanese rice paper that you can purchase at Open Studio. But any relatively smooth printing paper, like Arches, Stonehenge, or just like the above ground brand, is going to work totally fine. You also want to get some newsprint just to cover areas of your workspace that you don't want to get ink on. And also, it's actually really great to print on. You end up with like a very crisp image, and it's really good for making just practice copies. And I'm going to go over what you need for your general printing setup and just some kind of bits and pieces. So I like having a sheet of plastic or aluminum foil for covering the area that I'm going to roll my ink out on, just to avoid like the mess and just make the process a little easier. So you also need a wooden spoon for the printing process, and I'll show you why later. You need a metal spoon as well, and scissors, a ruler, pencil, and some painter's tape, all of which you might just have lying around if you've taken any basic studio courses, or which can be found super easily at any art supply or dollar store. And for cleanup, since we're using a water-based ink, you really don't need anything more complicated than like a wet rag and dish soap. Cleanup is super easy, and I also find that this ink doesn't really tend to stain things. I would recommend having an apron or an old shirt or a pair of painter's overalls as well. if you're anything like me, and you're probably going to get ink on yourself. So now that that's all taken care of, we can move on to some of the actual printing. And I'm just going to go over a few basic concepts of like carving and transferring your image. Since I do think experimentation and practice is really the best way to figure this out for yourself. So first and foremost, since Linocut is a form of relief printing, this means that any mark removed is going to become negative space. So what remains behind is what's going to get printed. And relating to that, it's also important to reverse your image since it will print as a mirror image of itself, if that's important to the image that you're printing. This is especially important for text because any text you print will print as like the mirror image of itself. I'm going to show you what this looks like with something I printed recently. So this is how it printed, and that is what the carving looks like. I hope that's not reversing on the camera, or else you're going to get the totally opposite idea, but I think you get the concept. So I've done that so often that I usually just freehand it, but it took me quite a long time to get there. And I find it helpful that if you have an image or text, you can just take a picture of it and flip it on your phone and work from there. Or you can also purchase contact paper to trace your design. And that's like helpful as well if you want to get it perfect. So I'm going to make a few lines on one of these just to show you some like kind of basic carving. I'm not going to take too long with this because I don't think you're going to be able to see too much over the camera. But so the speedball comes with this thin tip. You probably won't be able to see too well again. That is good for making sort of thinner lines and also pointillism, just like creating texture, creating kind of like the illusion of shading. Also comes with a larger tip that is a bit better for removing larger areas of linoleum. Again, it's like really just best to experiment with this for yourself. I'm just doing this to give you an idea of what this is going to look like when I print it in 1 second. This is not going to be the prettiest print, but it will get the job done. And so now that that's like taken care of, there are a couple of things that you need to do to prepare your workspace before you actually start printing, and to just like prepare in general. So one thing that you want to do is decide what size of paper you want to use for your image, which means thinking about your margins, the amount of negative space around your image. And you're probably not going to buy paper just right off the rack that's going to fit your print perfectly. So what you're going to need to do is figure out your margins. And I usually like to do about 1 or 2 inches on a small image, which will end up looking something like that. So it's not being like drowned in negative space, but it's still got some room to breathe. So to do this, you're going to measure the size of your linoleum. And this particular guy is, I believe, 2.5 by 3 inches. And I want to do 1 inch margins on each side. So that means that I'm going to be measuring 4.5 by 5 inches. And you're going to take these measurements and just transfer them onto a sheet of newsprint. It doesn't have to be totally perfect, especially if you're just doing a rough copy. But Yeah, fairly easy to do with just a ruler. I like using a square as well, but once you measure everything out, you can also just do that with even like a piece of paper or anything with a 90-degree angle. This is a lot easier to do at school just because we do have the cutting mats with the grids, and there's like really nice paper cutting machines. And pear bars as well. It's just really everything is easier when you're working in a studio. But it is totally fine to just cut this with scissors too. If you do have access to like a cutting mat and an X-Acto knife, it'd be a bit easier. And when you're cutting your paper, you want to think about your edition size as well, just to figure out how many sheets of paper to do. And the edition size is how many copies of each image we're making like at one time for printing. You really want to make quite a few, well, at least a few more sheets of paper than you think you're going to need. Something will always go wrong, and you're not going to be wanting to worry about like preparing a bunch of new paper while you're in the middle of printing and your hand ink. And so I did that with the newsprint. If you're using nicer paper, you want to just to practice and like pull a few proofs, which I'll explain later. So next you want to air, and like I said before, or mentioned the aluminum foil before, I like to set up a sheet of either plastic or aluminum to cover where I'm going to be printing and where I'm going to be rolling my ink out. So since this is where you're rolling your ink out, you want to get this as taut as possible. And it doesn't really need to be any particular size, just a little bit wider than your brayer, and I would say maybe twice as tall as it is wide. Cut this so I can fit it on my board. And yeah, because this is where you're rolling your ink out, you want to get it as taut as possible. I'm just going to do this on this board so I can hold it up to you and show you how my whole printing setup looks like. Because I don't think you can get a very good view of my table. At school, if you have a chance to take a print course, they're super great like glass top tables in that studio. They're very easy to clean off. I don't have any of those in my apartment, but this works totally fine too. Here is your extremely DIY printing surface. So now I'm going to use some painter's tape to make a rough registration setup. And this setup will help you get the image in roughly the same place in the paper each time. Which just helps it look like a little more neat and professional, like you're not going to have your image like flying all over the place. So to do this, you want to just take your paper and make a rough outline just around the edges with your painter's tape. At school, we have wooden L-shaped rigs to do this with. And it also is quite a lot easier to make a registration setup on the presses, but this has been working for me fairly well from registered quarantine. So after you've got this outline made, which will look like that, you want to take your linoleum and figure out where you want it to sit in the center. You can use a ruler to do this. If you're feeling reckless, you can just eyeball it. Yes, when you've got that figured out, you can make either a similar outline as you did with the first step, or just make kind of like a little L shape around the top left or top right corner to help you figure out where it's going to sit. And yeah, using this, you will be able to get your image in at least roughly the same place each time. So finally gotten to the point where you can actually start printing, and I'm going to use this rough little demo block just to give you a rough idea at first. I'm going to show you one of my finished prints after. But so the first thing we're going to do is roll out the palette, which is what the bed of ink we're using is called. And you want to just use the metal spoon to spread a thin line of ink across your palette. And you want to roll this out with your brayer. And as you'll see, I'm lifting it up at the end just to let the roller spin, so I'm not going over the same place palette, the same place on the brayer each time. And you want to do this sideways too. You're going to want to look for particular like thickness of ink on this. A little hard to figure out first, and it's probably something that you're going to need. You want it like to be able to coat the print properly and get a clear image. We also don't want it completely like thick, so you're working with weight. It can be kind of hard to explain over video, but there is a particular kind of sound to look out for. It's gonna sound almost like you're peeling Velcro almost. And it does take a while to figure out. You're probably not going to get this right on the first try. So the next step is inking your print, which I've placed on this sheet of newsprint so I don't get ink all over my workspace. And you're going to want to roll the brayer over it with one smooth roll. And you want to build up enough ink so that you're going to get a clear image, but not so much that it starts to fill in the part lines. And this can be kind of hard to figure out. Again, practice makes perfect. Something you do want to look out for is just putting on too much ink. If that happens, the only way to really deal with it is by washing your print out and starting over, which is not the end of the world. Then you're going to take your print and place it on the registration marks you've prepared, and you're going to take your newsprint and place it over top. So finally, with the spoon comes into play. You are going to move the paper around on top of the print, but also to just kind of like exert pressure with the back of the spoon over the whole print. And by doing this, you can get a fairly decent ink tone. When that's done, you're just going to carefully peel your paper off. And this is what the demo block looks like. So after that, you're going to want to lay it flat to dry. Water-based inks do tend to dry fairly quickly, but it does need to stay flat until it's dry. This can be kind of annoying if you live in an apartment. I usually end up with like 20 prints covering my bedroom floor for an hour or two, but it's a fast process, so you don't need to worry about that for long. And I'm just going to try this again with one of my finished prints to give you an idea of how that looks like. It's really the same process. If you're working with a bit more negative space, like I am with this guy, you're going to want to be careful to like try to avoid the negative space as much as you can, just to get kind of like as clean a print as possible. And you're probably going to have to run the brayer over each print like multiple times to get the proper buildup of ink. And you're going to do this in like one smooth pass as much as possible, so you're not like going back and forth with each successive roll, if that makes sense. And again, placing the paper within the registration lines. And there's some parts of the last one that I didn't give equal pressures, so I'm going to try to do a little better with this guy. Yeah, I did move it a little bit, so you end up with this kind of smudged appearance, which is, you know, it happens. It's not going to be perfect every time, but the good thing about printmaking is you can try again. And like I said before, the ink using is water-based and non-toxic, so I mean that partially means you don't need to worry if you get it on your skin. It's not going to kill you. And if you want, you can just throw away your palette completely or rinse it off in the sink for it. One last thing that I should mention is how to edition a print. And like I mentioned before, each front of a print that you do is called an edition. So if you're planning on doing it with a pen, maybe you do like 13 prints and you put 1 of 10 in the bottom left corner, the title in the center, and then your name in the bottom right. You might not be able to see the words, but you can see just where I put them on the print. You can write it either just below the image or at the bottom of the sheet of paper. I usually prefer to write it at the bottom, just because that way if you're framing the print, the text isn't necessarily visible and it just looks a bit cleaner and a bit nicer. Another thing is that the editioning is always done in pencil. Not sure why, but that's just how it is in printmaking. And I think that actually just about covers the basics of how to make a Linocut print at home. If you're interested in learning more about relief printing, I'd really recommend taking a course at OCAD. Our studios are amazing and the print techs are incredible. It's really, I mean, I'm biased because I'm a printmaker, but it's my favorite part of the school. I love working there. Open Studio in 401 Richmond also has classes, a little bit less financially accessible, I would say. Although their gallery is a really amazing place to find about other artists working in printmaking. It is actually how I found out about one of my favorite artists, Agatha Derrida, who works in woodcut with kind of laser printed overlays. You should really check her out if any of this piqued your interest and you're interested in relief printing now. Also, Center 3 in Hamilton, if you are in that area, is an amazing artist-run center. Has a lot of like different methods of printmaking in one place. Because it's an artist-run center, it is way more financially accessible than comparable studios. If you're a student, I think a membership is actually $50 a year, and a lot of amazing artists work out of that space, so I highly suggest checking it out. I hope you enjoyed my workshop, and yes, if there are any questions, I will take them now.
Cool. Thank you, Erica. That was awesome. Well, I had a couple questions, but you actually answered them all in the thing. Also, I don't know if this happened to any of the other people during the workshop, but my internet cut out a little bit. So apologies if that happened to anyone else. I don't know if it would affect because I'm hosting it on the thing, so I'm not sure. But does anyone have any questions from the chat? Okay, good. So other people didn't have that issue. I was worried that other people might have it cut out. Perfect. Yeah, I guess you mentioned a number of resources for students that wanted to print make on their own, like that they could find. Are there other methods of printmaking that are also simple to do if students want to research at home?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't very much difference between woodcut and linocut, but that is like another kind of relief printing you can do at home. You could do difficult, and yeah, you're working with more chemicals, but I have friends who have done that from home pretty successfully without any like studio training. So if you're feeling inclined, that's like absolutely something you could figure out.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think for me, the only one that I've tried at home is just screen printing. Yeah. Just because it's like simple to, I think it's one of the more simple ones, so they sell kits and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So that was a very thorough workshop. So like I said, it answered any question that I had. Yeah. Did anybody else have any questions? I didn't see any pop up in the chat. Maybe other people found that the workshop was very thorough as well. Okay, cool. I'm just seeing in the chat, people are saying the workshop was really helpful. So that's good to hear and good to see. Yeah, thank you, Erica, from everyone who's going to see it. You're going to see this on our Instagram